There are many different types of sources that you could use in your work. You'll make your choices about which ones are the most helpful based on what your question is. To get the ideas flowing, some types include books, magazines, newspapers, videos, people, websites, and journals. You may or may not be familiar with journals, so let's go into that a little bit more. There are two types: trade journals, which are publications for a particular industry like shipping, or academic journals, which are publications in a particular academic specialty like engineering or history. Here we're going to talk about the academic or scholarly journals, which include many scholarly articles in each publication. In a way, they can look very much like magazines, though usually they're less flashy, have fewer pictures, and often don't have glossy pages. Each academic journal has a number of articles in it, each one by a different person or team of people. The articles may all be within the same discipline, like engineering, but will be on different topics depending on what research they're reporting on. Many articles are written specifically to report on the results of an individual's or team's research, while others might be looking at many research studies that have been conducted, and is reporting on what new things we can learn by taking all of these studies into account. These are for an academic or scholarly audience, like other researchers or professors. Many academic journals use a process called peer review, which we'll learn about in a moment. The publication process for each article that gets included in a journal is fairly lengthy due to that peer review process. It typically takes many months or potentially multiple years to go from writing the article to having it appear in the published journal. So let's look at that peer review process. This is the process that many articles go through to get published in an academic journal. First, we have our researcher. She just completed a research study and learned some interesting things that she'd like to share with other researchers and people who study the same subject. To do that, she writes a paper with what her experiment was, how it went, what the results were. She submits the article to the editor of an academic journal, who takes a look to see if her work falls within the interests of the journal. If it does, he hands the article to a team of other experts in the field to review. This is where we get the name, peer review. These peers in the subject are also researchers and professors, and they evaluate the paper to determine if it's new and original information that hasn't been published before, if the experiment was sound and well designed, if the write-up meets their standards to ensure that other researchers could replicate the study to determine if they get the same results. You might notice that this is an important part of the scientific method. Can others do the same thing and get the same results? Can they adjust the experiment slightly and learn new things? If the paper does meet all of these criteria, they will likely return it to the author for some additional edits or changes. This is very common in the process, as it's almost impossible to meet every standard of a publication on the first try. The author can then make the changes, resubmit the paper to ensure it now meets their standards, and if it does, it gets published in the academic journal. It can then be read by people who subscribe to the journal. So now we have a bunch of different journals that all go through this process or something similar. How do we get access to them? We use library databases, which subscribe to many journals at once and then take them apart digitally so we can search for individual articles rather than having to flip through each issue of each journal. The database will help to categorize articles by their subject matter, note who wrote them and what their title is, and all of this will make it easy for us to search very specifically for articles that meet our research needs. All of these articles from all of these journals are then fed into the database. The library subscribes to many different databases, thereby giving you access to searching all of them. It's important to note that these subscriptions we have are included for you as an enrolled student. They're available to students, faculty, and staff, and other visitors on campus, but not to other people who aren't affiliated with the institution. This is because it follows an economic model that has a few paywalls along the way. Let's follow that money briefly to see where it goes. Institutions like universities or other research institutions pay researchers to conduct research. They then submit articles to journals which publish their material. Databases then subscribe to journals, and libraries subscribe to those databases. The articles have a significant monetary value, and we make sure to jump that hurdle on your behalf as students. So if you ever find an article online that's asking you to pay for it, know that we are in charge of getting that access for you. You should never have to pay money for an article. We can help you find it through our services, borrow it from another library for you, or help you find other information that meets your needs. All of this is to say that information, especially good information, has a real value. We're here to make sure that you have access to it. When you find academic or scholarly articles, you'll notice that they follow a pretty standard format, though it can be adjusted depending on the journal or the subject matter. Most scholarly articles start with an abstract, which is essentially a summary or quick report of what the article is about. Read this first, as it will give you a very good sense of whether the article is worth reading. It will then go into an introduction about the subject and what they're studying. Many will include a literature review, which is a review of what's already been written on the subject. This is a great way to find other sources on your topic. The methods and results go into the nitty-gritty of the experiment or research that was conducted. It tends to include a lot of statistical analysis and will be the most challenging part to understand. I recommend saving this portion until after you've read the other sections, as you'll be better prepared to understand it at that point. The discussion and conclusion talk about their findings from the research, discuss what went well and what could be improved, and makes recommendations for the next steps or further research. Very importantly, the end of the paper includes all the sources that the authors used to write the paper. If this paper is helpful, you'll likely find many other helpful papers in the references section. You'll recognize the references section as very similar to your own references or works cited section at the end of every paper that you write. Let's take a look at what all of this looks like in one scholarly article. Here's an example of a research article that you might be using in your research. It has all of the standard sections to it, but I thought it might be helpful for you to see what those would actually look like in an article. So here we start with the title of the article at the top. You can even see above it there's some more information about who the author is, the title of the journal, the volume, date, how many pages it is, as well as a standard link so that you would be able to return. It's listed as a research article rather than as a response or other kind of article, and then gives the title. Below that, you see the authors, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth author, so this had 5 people working on it. And the little numbers in superscript next to each name indicate which institutions they're associated with. It's generally a good practice for people to understand where these people are working, helps them contact those people, and is also a source of pride for those institutions. There's a recommendation of who you should speak with if you have questions or comments about the article. And here's a really helpful tidbit. It shows you when the article was initially received, when it was accepted for publication, and then when it was actually published. So you can see this article actually had a fairly quick turnaround. It was received on the 19th of September 2018. It was accepted for publication on the 15th of November 2018. And it was finally published on the 26th of February 2019. So initially submitted in September and published in February. The editor for this is also listed so you know who was working on it, and you can see what year the copyright belongs to. This initial block of text is the abstract. That's often not labeled, but it is before the introduction, and it gives you a good idea of what the article is about. Next, we have the introduction, giving some information about the subject that we're learning about. And then the second section is the methodology. Here it's called modeling and method. There are likely going to be some equations or mathematical formulae here if you're reading a math or science article. Some diagrams. These do have pictures, but they tend to be technical ones and only as needed. And a lot more math. This is a part that you'll probably want to read after you've read the other parts of the article because it is so dense. You can see this lasts for several pages, so it is very thorough. There are titles below each of the figures so that you have a little context for how to read them. And then we finally reach section 3, the results and discussions. Sometimes results and discussion are separate sections, sometimes they're put together. It really depends on the format of that particular journal and what the subject material is. This is a section that will give you information about what actually happened during the experiment, what they learned, and how they analyzed the data. So again, you can see a lot of those charts and graphs. Those are the results of their experiment. Some more calculations and formulae. Again, this can be a little dense. The results tend to be denser than the discussion, so if they have split those two up, then you might read the discussion first. And then we get into a summary. That's sometimes called a conclusion. And that leads us basically to the end of the article. You can see that they do note whether there are any conflicts of interest. That's whether they have a stake in this in some way outside of academia, whether they have invested in a company or something of that nature. There might be some acknowledgments because research does take quite a lot of work of teams as well as funding from different institutions. And then there's the really helpful references section. So if this turned out to be an article that was really helpful for you, you would be able to look at those references and probably find some other material that's also really helpful. This is what I like to call citation dredging. You can see they've used just a huge number of sources. And you would be able to go look at those and make sure that you agree with the conclusions that they drew from them, and also just learn more information. And that leads us to the end of this article. Most of our articles through databases do include a copyright notice as the final page, just to make sure that the copyright is clear and that you don't sell or redistribute the article in a way that is not allowed for.